Welcome back to the journey of a king. Last time, we witnessed David's rise from the wilderness to the throne of Israel. But a king's dreams often stretch beyond his own lifetime. In this chapter, David dreams of building a home for God, a temple to house his presence. But instead, he receives a promise, a covenant that will ripple through generations. What is this eternal vow? How does it point, not to a building, but to a kingdom beyond walls and borders? Join us as we unravel the mystery of David's legacy, one that reaches far into the future and carries the hope of all humanity.
The palace was quiet in the early morning hours, the first rays of sunlight stretching across the walls of cedar that surrounded me. I often found myself awake at this time, my thoughts restless as I considered all the Lord had done in my life. From the pastures of Bethlehem to the throne of Israel, I had walked a path I could never have imagined, yet it was not a path without its struggles or failures. I stood by the window, gazing out toward the city below. Jerusalem, the city of David. My city, they called it, though it belonged to the Lord far more than it did to me. My heart swelled with gratitude as I thought of all he had given me. A united kingdom, victories over my enemies, and the Ark of the Covenant resting within our walls. But even as I gave thanks, a question lingered in my mind. A question that had taken me 1,000 years in the past. How could it be that I dwelt in a house of cedar while the Ark of God remained in a tent? The thought weighed heavily on me, filling my chest with a longing I could not shake. I had seen the Ark carried into Jerusalem with songs and dances, the presence of God returning to his people. It had been a moment of triumph, yet every time I looked upon the tent that housed it, I felt a pang of unease. Well, surely the Lord deserves more than this, a house where his name could dwell forever. And I called for Nathan, the prophet. He arrived swiftly, his expression thoughtful, as always. I shared with him what was on my heart, the vision I had for a house for the Lord. Here I am, I told him, living in a house of cedar, while the Ark of God remains in a tent. Nathan's response was immediate, his confidence in my intentions clear. Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. His words filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. At last I thought I could begin to repay even a fraction of the goodness the Lord had shown me. My mind began to race with ideas and plans for a temple unlike anything the world had ever seen. But that night, as I rested, the Lord spoke to Nathan. His message came as a gentle yet firm redirection, one that Nathan delivered to me the next morning. I could see the weight of the words on his face as he entered my chambers, his usual calmness tinged with hesitation. You are not the one to build a house for my name, he said. Your son, who will come after you, will build it. The words stung, though I knew they came from the Lord. I had longed to offer this gift, to honor God with something that reflected his greatness. Yet, even in my disappointment, there was a promise that filled me with awe. The Lord would establish my house, a dynasty that would endure forever. Through my line, a kingdom would arise that would never fail. As I sat in prayer that evening, my heart was full, not with pride but with gratitude. Who was I, a shepherd boy, that the Lord would choose me for such a promise? The vision of the temple was not mine to complete, but I would prepare the way. I would gather the materials, lay the foundation, and ensure that my son would have everything he needed to carry out the task. I rose from my knees with a renewed sense of purpose. The temple was not for me to build, but it was mine to begin. And in that beginning, I saw the faithfulness of the God who had carried me through every trial and triumph. This was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a legacy that would point to something far greater than a temple of stone. A kingdom that would reign forever in his name. The thought consumed me as I paced the palace halls. Every glance at the tent of the Ark of the Covenant stirred a longing in my heart, a discontent I couldn't shake. The Ark represented the presence of the Lord, the one who had lifted me from the pastures of Bethlehem to the throne of Israel. How could I, a man, dwell in a palace of cedar while my God's dwelling was a mere tent? I could still see the moment the ark had been brought into Jerusalem. The streets were alive with song, the people rejoicing as they saw the ark come to rest within our city walls. I danced before the Lord that day, unashamed of my joy. Yet now, each time I passed by that tent, my heart grew heavy. Surely, I thought, the Lord deserves for life a temple grand and eternal to honor his name. One evening, the weight of this thought was too much to bear. I summoned Nathan, the prophet, my trusted advisor, and a man whose words carried the voice of the Lord. When he arrived, I wasted no time in sharing the burden of my heart. "Here I am," I told him, "living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful but encouraging. "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it," he said, "for the Lord is with you." His words filled me with a sense of affirmation, as though the desires of my heart were aligned with the will of God. That night I allowed myself to dream, not for myself, but for the Lord. I imagined a temple that would stand as a testament to his greatness, a place where the people of Israel could come to worship and offer their sacrifices. But the next morning, Nathan returned, his face somber, his steps hesitant. I knew before he spoke that the Lord had given him a different message. "You are not the one to build a house for my name," he said, his voice gentle but firm. My heart sank. Nathan continued, explaining that while I would not build the temple, my son, the one who would reign in peace, would carry out the task. And then came the words that humbled me to my core. "The Lord declares to you that he will establish a house for you." It was not the answer I had hoped for, but it was far greater than I could have imagined. The Lord's promise stretched beyond my life, beyond the reign of my son, to an eternal kingdom. Through my lineage, he would establish a throne that would never fail. It was a covenant not just of a temple, but of a legacy, a promise of a kingdom that would ultimately point to the Messiah. I fell to my knees that evening, overwhelmed by the grace of God. "Who am I, sovereign Lord," I prayed, "that you have brought me this far? And now you speak of the future of my house, Lord God. Is this your usual way of dealing with man, sovereign Lord?" In the days that followed, I began to prepare, not to build, but to gather, to plan, to ensure that the vision of the temple would be realized in God's perfect time. I called for cedar from Lebanon, gathered gold, silver, and precious stones, and enlisted the finest craftsmen. Each step, each act of preparation was my offering to the Lord. This temple would not bear my name, but it would bear my heart, a heart that longed to honor the God who had been faithful through every triumph and failure. Though my hands would not set its stones, my faith and devotion would lay its foundation. And in that I found peace, knowing that the Lord's plans were far greater than my own. I sat in the quiet of the palace, the words of Nathan still echoing in my mind. God's promise was more than I could have ever imagined. He had not only declared that my son would build the temple, but he had also spoken of a covenant, an eternal kingdom that would endure through my lineage. My heart swelled with both humility and awe as I tried to comprehend the magnitude of his words. "Who am I, sovereign Lord?" I had asked Nathan when he relayed the Lord's message. The question was not rhetorical. I was the youngest of my father's sons, a shepherd boy with no claim to greatness. Yet the Lord had chosen me, not for my strength, but for my heart. He had taken me from the pastures, from tending sheep, and made me ruler over his people Israel. Now he had made a promise that would extend far beyond my lifetime. I knelt before the Ark of the Covenant that evening, the flickering light of the oil lamps casting shadows on the tent's walls. My prayer was one of gratitude and wonder. "Is this your usual way of dealing with man, sovereign Lord?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. The Lord's kindness was overwhelming, his plans so far beyond what I could have dreamed. The covenant was not just for me. It was for all of Israel, and I realized for the entire world. The Lord had promised that my house and kingdom would endure forever, that my throne would be established for eternity. These words pointed to something far greater than the reign of my son or the building of the temple. They pointed to the Messiah, the one who would come to redeem not just Israel, but all of humanity. The weight of the promise settled on my heart, not as a burden, but as a call to faithfulness. I knew I would not see its fulfillment in my lifetime, but that did not diminish its significance. Instead, it filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. I would prepare for the temple, yes, but I would prepare for the temple, yes. I would also live in a way that honored the covenant God had made with me. My actions, my leadership, my worship, all would reflect the gratitude I felt for his faithfulness. I began to plan with a fervor that surprised even my closest advisors. The temple would be a place where God's presence would dwell, but it would also stand as a symbol of his covenant. I called for the finest materials, gathered skilled craftsmen, and outlined the plans that would guide my son when his time came to build. Yet my thoughts often returned to the promise of an eternal kingdom, the Messiah, the one who would establish a throne that would never fail. I did not know his name or the time of his coming, but I trusted in the God who had delivered me from the lion, the bear, and the spear of Goliath. He had been faithful then, and he would be faithful now. He would deliver me from the lion, the bear, and the spear of Goliath. He had been faithful to him all along, the lion, the bear, and the spear of Goliath. As the days passed, my prayers became less about the temple and more about the temple and more about the generations to come. Lord, I prayed, let my house serve you faithfully. Let the one who sits on my throne walk in your ways. And when the time comes, let the world see your salvation through the King you have promised. God's covenant was not about my glory, but about his. It was a reminder that his plans are eternal, his promise is unshakable, and though I would not see the fullness of this promise, I rested in the knowledge that the God who had called me was the same God who would fulfill every word he had spoken. The years had brought wisdom, but they had also brought the awareness of my mortality. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my hands trembled ever so slightly when I held my harp. The days of battle, of leading the charge into the fray, were behind me. My role now was not to fight, but to prepare, to ensure that the kingdom and the vision God had entrusted to me would endure. Solomon, my son, was young. Brilliant, yes, and full of promise, but still untested in the ways of leadership. The task that lay before him was monumental. He would not only inherit the throne, but also the charge to build the temple, the house of the Lord. It was a task I had longed to complete myself, yet God, in his wisdom, had chosen Solomon for this sacred duty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills of Jerusalem, casting a golden glow over the city, I called Solomon to my side. He entered the room with a mix of confidence and curiosity, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the weight of the wisdom I wished to impart. "Come, my son," I said, motioning for him to sit beside me. "We have much to discuss." I looked into his eyes, seeing in them the future of Israel. "The Lord has chosen you, Solomon," I began, my voice steady but laced with emotion, "not only to sit on the throne of Israel, but to build a house for his name. This temple will not be for us, it will be for him, a place where his glory will dwell among his people." Solomon listened intently as I described the vision for the temple, the plans that had been forming in my heart for years. I spoke of the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, and the materials I had gathered. Cedar from Lebanon, gold, silver, and precious stones. "This will not be a house of ordinary splendor," I told him. "It will be a place where heaven touches earth, where the nations will come to know the God of Israel." But my words weren't only about the structure itself. I spoke of the heart required to undertake such a task. "Strength and courage will not be enough," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You must walk in the ways of the Lord, keeping his commands and seeking his guidance in all things. The work you do will only prosper if it is rooted in obedience and faith." I prayed with Solomon that night, and our voices lifted together in supplication to the Lord. I prayed for wisdom, for strength, and for a heart fully devoted to God. I knew the road ahead would not be easy for him. Leadership was a burden as much as it was an honor, and the building of the temple would require more than just skill and resources. It would demand faith, perseverance, and humility. In the days that followed, I gathered the leaders of Israel and charged them to support Solomon in his task. I spoke of the Lord's faithfulness, reminding them that the temple was not just Solomon's responsibility, but a covenant with the entire nation. "Be strong and courageous," I urged them, echoing the words I had spoken to my son. "This is the work of the Lord, and he will not fail us." As I watched Solomon begin to step into his role, my heart swelled with pride and hope. He was young, yes, but he was chosen. And as I prepared to pass the mantle of leadership to him, I knew that my role was not ending, but shifting. I would not see the temple completed, but I had laid its foundation, not in stone, but in faith and preparation. My trust was in the Lord, the God who had carried me from the pastures of Bethlehem to the throne of Israel. He would carry Solomon too, guiding his steps as he undertook the greatest task of his life. And in that, I found peace, knowing that the work of the Lord would endure far beyond my days. As I sat in the quiet of my chambers, my thoughts turned again to the temple, the vision that had been my dream but would become Solomon's legacy. The materials were gathered and the plans were meticulously drawn, yet I could not help but reflect on what this temple truly meant, not just for my son, but for Israel, and for the God who had carried us through every trial. The temple was more than a building. It was a testament to God's faithfulness. Every piece of gold, every stone hewn from the quarries, was a symbol of His promises fulfilled. As I envisioned its completion, I saw the people of Israel gathered in its courts, their voices rising in praise, their sacrifices offered in reverence. The thought filled my heart with both joy and longing. I often spoke to Solomon about what the temple would signify. "This house is not for us," I told him during one of our evening conversations. "It is for the Lord, a place where His name will dwell and where the nations will come to know His greatness." I could see the weight of this responsibility in Solomon's eyes, but I also saw determination. He understood, as I did, that the temple was not about its grandeur, but about the God it would glorify. As the days of my life grew fewer, I found myself reflecting more on the legacy I would leave. My victories in battle, my unification of Israel, even my reign, all of these paled in comparison to the eternal significance of God's promise. The temple, though magnificent, was only a part of that promise. The greater fulfillment would come through the Messiah, the one who would establish an eternal kingdom. I prayed for Solomon constantly, that he would have the wisdom to lead and the humility to serve. I knew the challenges he would face, the temptations of power, the weight of expectations. But I also knew the God who had guided me would guide him. Walk in His ways. I told him, my voice firm with conviction. Seek His counsel in all things, and the work of your hands will prosper. The people of Israel looked to the temple as a beacon of hope, a symbol of God's presence among them. And I prayed that they would also see it as a reminder of His covenant, a reflection of His unchanging faithfulness. I wanted them to remember that it was not the gold or the cedar that made the temple sacred. It was the presence of the Lord. As my strength waned, I called for the leaders of Israel and charged them to support Solomon in his task. I spoke of the vision for the temple, but more importantly, I spoke of the God who had been faithful to us through every generation. "This is His house," I said, my voice steady despite the weariness in my bones. "It is a place where we will meet with Him, but it is also a reminder that His promises extend far beyond these walls." In the quiet of the night, I often thought of the Messiah, the one who would come to fulfill God's eternal covenant. The temple would stand as a foreshadowing of that greater promise, a place where heaven and earth touched, pointing to the day when God Himself would walk among us. Though I would not live to see the temple completed, I found peace in knowing that I had played my part. The foundation had been laid, not just in stone, but in faith, in obedience, and in trust. As I prepared to pass the torch to Solomon, I prayed that he would carry it with the same devotion, that he would lead Israel closer to the God who had called us His people. The temple was Solomon's to build, but it was the Lord's to fill. And in that truth I rested, knowing that His presence would dwell among us, guiding us, shaping us, and pointing us to the eternal kingdom He had promised. As the days of my life drew to a close, I found myself often reflecting on the covenant the Lord had made with me. It was a promise unlike any other, one that stretched beyond my understanding and reached into the heart of eternity. The God who had chosen me from the pastures of Bethlehem, who had delivered me from the pastures of Bethlehem, who had delivered me from the lions, bears, and giants, had spoken of a kingdom that would never end. It was not just a promise for me or even for Solomon. It was a promise for all people, for all time. I remembered the words Nathan had spoken on the Lord's behalf. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. At the time, I had been overwhelmed by the magnitude of those words. Who was I, a shepherd boy, that the Creator of heaven and earth would establish such a covenant with me? Even now, as I sat in the quiet of my chambers, the weight of that promise filled me with both awe and humility. The temple, though magnificent, was but a shadow of what was to come. Its gold-covered walls and sacred chambers were a symbol of God's presence among His people, yet I knew that no building could contain the fullness of His glory. The covenant was not about stone or cedar. It was about the Messiah, the anointed one who would come through my line to fulfill God's ultimate plan of redemption. I thought of the Psalms I had written, many of which spoke of this promised king. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." I had written, not fully understanding the depths of those words, but knowing they pointed to something far greater than my reign or Solomon's. The Messiah would be a king unlike any other, one who would rule with justice and righteousness, whose kingdom would have no end. As I prepared to pass the mantle of leadership to Solomon, I prayed that he would walk in the ways of the Lord and that he would build the temple with wisdom and devotion. But even as I focused on the present, my heart was anchored in the future. The Messiah was coming, and his kingdom would be the fulfillment of every promise God had made, not just to me, but to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to all of Israel. The vision of the Messiah gave me peace as I considered the trials and triumphs of my life. My victories and failures, my moments of faith, and my times of sin, they were all part of a larger story, one that God was weaving together for His glory. The covenant reminded me that my role was not to achieve perfection, but to point to the one who would. In the quiet of the night, I would often lift my voice in prayer, my words both a song of gratitude and a cry for the fulfillment of the promise. Lord, you are my shepherd. I lack nothing. You guide me along the right paths for your name's sake. And though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. These words, born of my journey, now carry a deeper meaning as I thought of the Messiah who would one day lead all of us into the eternal green pastures of His kingdom. The promise of the Messiah was not just a hope for the future, it was the anchor of my present. It shaped how I led, how I prayed, and how I prepared Solomon for the task ahead. And as I gazed out over Jerusalem, the city that would one day witness the fulfillment of this promise, my heart swelled with gratitude. The Lord had been faithful to me, and I knew He would be faithful to His word. Though my days were nearing their end, the story was far from over. The Messiah was coming, and through Him, the throne of David would be established forever. In that truth, I found my greatest joy and my deepest peace.
David's dream to build a temple led to something far greater, an eternal covenant that would shape not just his reign, but the future of the world. How will this promise unfold, and what does it mean for generations to come? If this chapter reminded you of God's purpose in your life, like this video and leave your reflections in the comments. Share this message of hope with others and subscribe to God's Story so you'll be ready for the next part of this incredible tale.